I'd like to introduce the last speaker. I will do lots of tidy up about various books that I want to auction and various DVDs that I've been given of naughty conferences and that sort of thing. But I'd like to talk about Stewart Home, communism, nihilism, neoism and decadence. I've given three talks on the extreme left. One was called Marxism and the Frankfurt School and the New Left. Another was called The Totalitarian Politics of 1984. And another one was about the concept of brainwashing and the use by the North Koreans and the Chinese of behaviourist techniques, particularly on prisoners in the Korean War, a totally forgotten struggle now, and a novel by an Italian-American called Pellini that was based on those events. Now, Stewart Home is an incredibly obscure figure who's on the margins of, the cultural avant-garde. So I'm going to come to him towards the latter stages of the talk when I've dealt with some of the sort of building blocks to begin with. Most conservatives with a small c look around Western European countries like Britain today and wonder why they're living in a mildly but evidently left-wing society. They wonder why they're supposed to have won but have actually lost. As they look around them, everything's changed from what it was 40 to 50 years ago, every normative social value and experience, and they wonder why that's occurred. There are many reasons for why it's occurred, but one is the complete containment and taking over of the cultural space by what we'll call cultural Marxism, or Marxian ideas, or soft left ideas, or post-communist ideas, and they're marched through the institutions after the 1960s, but it didn't just happen then, it had been prepared much earlier in the 20th century. Marxism's a doctrine before Lenin added the conspiratorial element of a vanguard party that seizes power with its paramilitary wing in a declining state. Marxism is a doctrine that originates from the middle of the 19th century and has a reputation of idealistic and utopian socialisms, some religious and some secular, that preceded it. Marx believed he had a science of history, that the thing was prior and determined, that history could be read like a runic pattern or like a pattern in a Persian carpet, and he was the master of the dialectic that would determine humanity's future. We now know that the sort of nightmarish regimes that were created across the planet in the 20th century on the basis of some or all of his ideas failed, and most of them have been destroyed. But their legacy is still here. Claire Short's got a bit of a witness at the moment in the liberal press because of her appearance at the Chilcot inquiry. She said something very interesting when the Soviet Union collapsed. She said, communism is over, but Marxism is not. And that's a very prescient remark, because what's happened in the Western world is that the idea that everything is economically predetermined in Marxian theory, that everything has a social dynamic which is structured and physical at the basis of economic life and that is materialistic, has been changed, and was changed at the beginning of the 20th century by an Italian communist theorist in prison called Gramsci. He had the idea that the superstructure and the base, that which was beneath and economic and material, that which was above and philosophical and cultural, can be disjoined, they can be separated and teased apart. That's actually a heresy in classical Marxism, but it enabled an enormous vista of struggle to be opened up right across academic, artistic and intellectual and media-related life, right across the West. Part of the left disengaged from the politics of vanguardism and engaged in what is now largely called cultural struggle. One of the great weaknesses of all forms of conservatism, whether Gaullism in France or republicanism in the United States or Christian democracy in Germany and Italy and elsewhere, is their refusal to fight cultural struggle, their refusal to believe that their enemies were in deadly earnest. In the 1960s, persons who were regarded as reactionary, quote-unquote, particularly in the academy, used to laugh at a lot of what was occurring. It was almost a joke. I'm sure most people are aware of that satire called Porterhouse Blue, by Tom Sharp, which is based upon Peterhouse College, Cambridge, of all these reactionary and ultra-dons, people like Maurice Cowling, people like Roger Scruton, who were associated with that college. They're metaphysical or deep blue conservatives, illiberal conservatives, people who are right on the edge of the conservative range of opinion before the far right begins, as far as you can go within the mainstream, basically. Now, those individuals, and Callan, who I knew once, was dead, he's dead now, they didn't give in, but in a way they didn't understand that in order to fight back against the tidal wave of leftist ideas throughout the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s and thereafter, you had to go further out ideologically. Even if you weren't prepared to make organisational commitments, even in the terms of fellow travelling, you had to use far-right ideas, even if you didn't call them that, to fight against the left in its militancy. And Basically, conservative academics from Michael Oakeshott onwards refused to do so, absolutely refused to do so. And in doing so, they basically put the noose around their own neck in relation to the forces that were coming. Because their enemies were in deadly earnest. They wanted to transform the mindset of Western societies, and the way that they configured to do that wasn't through vanguard parties, although they supported them, wasn't through doctrines of social revolution, although they may have residually supported that, but was by changing the grammar that people used to think with at the advanced level. Strangely, for militant egalitarians, they used an extreme form of cultural elitism. You take the universities, you take the dons and the academics in the universities, you take the people who mark the PhDs that provide the methodology of attainment through which you get a don at the university. You then replicate that through all male and female students at the first, second and third levels of tertiary education, never mind the people coming up from the secondary level. Then as egalitarian educationalism spreads, we're going to have a society now where 30%, 50% go to university. There's at the University of Slough, which used to be the Pally in the Thames Valley. You can do degrees in hairdressing, you can do degrees in golf studies, you can do degrees in anything, you know. You send this away to a P.O. box number in Edinburgh with a couple of Weetabix packets and you get a PhD in nuclear physics that's straight back in the post. You know, this is the way it's going. There are a few upper-class people now who refuse to go to university. Princess Diana refused to go, partly because she wasn't too bright, but also because it doesn't have any social cachet anymore, because if everyone goes, it's got no kudos, has it? This is the idea. If everything is degraded, do you want to eat the bread that's been in every other mouth? You know, this is the thing about egalitarian ideas. But the plan of leftist subversion, which is a wave of academics in all sorts of areas, not necessarily network, not necessarily doing it in relation to each other, but doing it in relation to the logic of their studies. And they do it in discourse after discourse. They do it in economic theory, which before Keynes was classical liberal methodology. Arthur Marshall, say, being the last of that particular school, revived by Hayek and Friedman in the middle of the 20th century as a dissident current that would then come back. Keynes comes first, and Marxist economics economists like Joan Robinson, Professor Joan Robinson at Cambridge, comes later. Then you go to anthropology. Anthropology, the first great textbook of anthropology is Gobineau's book on the essay on the inequality of the human races. This begins anthropology as a subject. This is a quote-unquote racist text. Anthropology is a science or semi-science that always has to deny its first text, because its first text is now so offensive in relation to all of the discourses that have come after. From the early part of the 20th century, you get the growing up of various discourses which are called social or socialized anthropology. The idea that race has nothing to do with anthropology, when race is the periodic table of anthropology and is the taxonomy of the human within that particular academic discipline. You reach a situation where by the 1970s, if a don at, say, the University of Sussex, an ultra-left institution on the south coast, said that there were cardinal racial differences in intelligence between people, there would have been an absolute riot on that campus, an absolute riot, which would have to be controlled by the police and the authorities. One thing the left realised throughout the 20th century is that people who are very mental and people who are very abstracted in terms of their intellect can be physically intimidated very easily. The mind and the body are so split in Western life that all you have to do is have a small mob wave their fist at a couple of dons and they're prostrated and they can't do anything and they're in fear of their lives and they will write in a different way afterwards. Trotsky said in a pamphlet called The Necessity of Red Terror, which was published in 1917, that you shoot 1,000 to intimidate 1,000,000. But all you need to do in many universities is lob a brick through on Freshers' Day and people are frightened to discuss, to write about and to theorise about whole sets of ideas. Everyone knows that there is a spectrum since the French Revolution of far left, moderate left, centre, moderate right, radical right views. Since about 1968, the radical right chunk, which is to the right of Oakeshott, Scruton and Cowling, has been broken off and cannot be talked about other than as critique. You can talk about how you detest these ideas, you can talk about how evil and wrong they are, you can talk about how mistaken they are, but they can't be adumbrated in and of themselves. This is complicated because there are certain academies, such as the French one, where that's not always true. And this is because in France there was a very powerful intellectual fascist tradition, essentially that's what it was, which goes right through to today, and even to the new right. And there's a degree to which in the Sorbonne, say in the 70s, you could see a poster saying, Drew La Rochelle lecture this afternoon. He committed suicide, of course, after the war because he was a collaborationist intellectual with Abetz and other people in the German Cultural Ministry in Paris in occupied France at that time. Now, so it's not uniform. These things are process-led and dynamic. And it doesn't just happen in economics and anthropology, it happens in psychology, it happens in sexology, it happens in English literature, it happens in the creation of new discourses, such as cultural studies, which is the dissemination of ideas about mass culture. And it happens in critical theory. Critical theory is a viewpoint that's grown up across the arts and across the humanities and even into areas of law like criminology, which can also be considered to be one of these ologies, if you like, one of these subjects. Other areas are history of art, aesthetics, in philosophy courses, philosophy itself, and so on. The Anglo-American world, of course, had an empirical view of philosophy, largely since Hobbes, but certainly since Russell in the 20th century, and a hostility to European philosophy, which meant there was less Marxist influence here. But the trouble with Bertrand Russell's type of philosophizing is it doesn't believe that any of the big questions can be answered. And therefore philosophy itself becomes slightly pointless and a cul-de-sac where you discuss the language you use to arrive at a concept that you might arrive at, for which there are multiple interpretations and which you are forever unsure. In and of itself, that's the preparation, this radical tepid uncertainty, which leads from conservatism to liberalism and from liberalism to something that's a bit more certain and lies to the left of it. Everything in Western societies has moved to the left throughout the 20th century. I'm not a Christian, but you could argue that after Vatican II, many Catholics became Protestants. Many Protestants became liberals. Many secularist liberals who are ex-Protestants moved further to the left and adopted views that they would have regarded as semi-extreme in the past, as long as they're not connected to physical force, militant working class politics, vanguardism, and the absolute politics of communism. You have many left-wing liberals now who have views which are to the left of hardcore communists in the 20s and 30s, and they don't realize that, and they're horrified by the atrocities of Stalin and Mao and Pol Pot and all of the others. But what they don't realize is that they have imbibed a doctrine of totalitarian niceness and squeaky keen correctness about these concepts, which existed in a way that their minds were attuned to before they became conversant with it. Now, this march through the institutions has also been a march through the media, because when you have an intellectual clerisy, it tends to control the conceptual ideas in the society, and the way the society talks to itself in modernity is through the media, and also propaganda and ideas about how you talk to the media. Most polytechnics and post-polytechnics now, because polytechnics were once vocational institutions, of course, dominated by people who tended to support the Labour Party. Now they've been upgraded to new universities, or universities have been downgraded to new universities, which are polytechnics. Because if all have a degree, what does it mean? In America, you can go to a university and you don't necessarily, outside the Ivy League, have to have the qualifications to get in. So you have a remedial course. There's a considerable number of people from certain types of racial minorities on those remedial courses. Taught to do English, taught to do maths, and then they do sports science or sports psychology. They won't be doing physics, they won't be doing mathematics, they won't be doing metaphysics, they won't be doing Shakespeare. There are certain colleges now that have votes about whether Shakespeare should be on the English course. But that's a mistake, you see, because democracy is always a mistake. Hardline Marxists, when they allow the students to vote, the students, even though they're liberal, often come up with more conservative results than the professors want. That's the logic of vanguardism. You see, you don't allow them to decide. You say Shakespeare's a reactionary Elizabethan bigot with undue essentialist notions that you shouldn't permit. The notion of essentialism has come in the last 30 to 40 years in relation to great fads in intellectual life. It has to be understood that for the last 100 years or so, all mainstream, hardcore Western intellectual developments have been atheistic. They've taken atheism as read, not as something to be debated. The first great ideology after the war was existentialism, which contained many elements, including a dissentient far-right strand as well. Existentialism was replaced by a new creed, fad, wave of history, whatever you want to call it, called structuralism, which relates to ideas at the beginning of the 20th century called formalism. Then people got bored with structuralism. Structuralism was around at the time of the student revolts in the late 1960s. Not totally a left-wing idea, but in a way bent towards the left by certain ideas. If the revolutionary left on campus couldn't take an idea as read, they would turn it around. Hegel was not a left-wing thinker, but left-wing Hegelianism emerged. And Marx was a part, with Engels, of a group of left Hegelians. They used to meet in a beer cellar prior to the German Revolution of 1848 to discuss left theory. Similarly, structuralism, left structuralism begins to emerge, particularly with Levi-Strauss in anthropology and with Saussure in linguistics. These ideas relate to certain currents in modernist art, in particular in the late 19th and early 20th century. And as we approach this subject area, we get a bit closer to home, who's nominally the sort of the hook that I'm hanging this particular talk on. Now, you can't do English at a contemporary British university, certainly outside Oxbridge, where there's just a received canon, and not come across critical theory. Critical theory is based upon a notion called deconstruction, and most people who are sort of intellectually minded have heard the word deconstruction somewhere floating around, floating in the back pages of the Observer, colour supplement, that sort of thing. They've heard the word. Deconstruction is another word for post-structuralism, which is the ideology of the new fad that replaced structuralism in the 60s and 70s. It's most so closely associated with a thinker called Jacques Derrida, who wrote a number of books basically saying that history doesn't exist, that biology doesn't exist, that the writer of a text does not exist. There is only the text. There is only the grammar of the text. A painting can be a text, a poster can be a text, a film can be a text. Only the text, nothing but the text. It's the view that essentialism leads to the gates of Auschwitz, which is repeated again and again as a mantra within these particular courses. They believe that any prior identity, say the statement men and women are different, the John and Jane book, a child says men and women are different. Wrong on every count. Prior essentialism as to gender, revolutionary, sub-genocidal, reactionary ideology in relation to the specification of male and female. Don't you know men and women are interchangeable? Don't you know that they are the same? But if somebody says, but don't they have different brains? Lies put about by eugenicists, linked to reactionary and essentialist ideas, again, rerouted to the ovens. Listen to your theory. And of course, in these areas, to think differently from the nature of this theory is to be impossible, because you will not finish that course. You will not even get a 2-1, which is the sort of median level for your average student in that course, if you don't go along with this. And some of this thinking relates to Western ideas that are very far back. Because in medieval scholasticism, there's the doctrine of hermeneutics, whereby you analyse the text of the text of the text, you look inside it to see the hint of the divine that is there, and some of these ideas actually do come out of that particular trajectory, you see. So in some ways, it's a very ancient thing that's been repositioned and is being reused for hostile purposes. Only the core theorists in this sort of area, Deleuze, Guattari, Derrida, and others, would actually know that that is the case. When the Enlightenment and modern scientific rationalism began, and they argued that the schoolmen were concerned about the number of angels who danced on the top of a pen, and philosophy was about natural process and law of nature, as the Greeks believed 2,000 years before, 1,500 years before their postulations, of course, there was a degree to which they thought they got rid of that type of thinking. But interestingly, that type of thinking, which in some ways is very reactionary, quote-unquote, has come back through these new left ideas. The one thinker that's partly outside all of this and has a special status as a monster within the 20th century is Martin Heidegger. Now, Martin Heidegger was an extreme essentialist and was a religious thinker, but was highly influenced by these ideas of extreme hermeneutics and the peeling away of the onion of the text. Heidegger has one book that's 400 pages saying what is thinking, or what is the nature of thinking. Heidegger wrote 80 books, all 80, most of which have never been released. And although Heidegger is one of the most radical thinkers of the 20th century, Heidegger's political affiliation, if only for a year, between 1933 and 1934, has meant that, in a sense, he has become an unperson. After the war, he was allowed to write and continue to write. He used to write in the Black Forest. He had a wooden cabin in the Black Forest, and he just used to commune in this this particular wooden fastness, this shed almost, with nature and by himself, in pure theory. Now, a lot of these ideas are based upon pure theory. They're based upon the idea that the bourgeois, the enemy in Marxian terms, goes to life with common sense, The Marxist goes to life with his theory. Only if you see the veil of theory before reality, the pink prism through which reality is refracted, only then can you be in history. Only then are you truly alive, because you're interpreting the dialectic of future knowledge. Now, the irony is that these communistic systems that stately impose these ideas on people have all collapsed. People who lived in Poland during Gomulka and other regime leaders had to do Marxist-Leninism 4 times a week. Just like the Catholic schools that these schools replaced, where you did religion 4 times a week. And you did Marxist-Leninist theory 4 times a week. There was a far-left party in Britain called the Revolutionary Communist Party, which was a split from the Socialist Workers' Party, a so-called rightist deviation within Marxist-Leninism. In 1986, they set exams for their cadres. You had to do exams on Grundrisse and groundwork and and Capital, volumes 1, volumes 2, volumes 3, to pass exams on this sort of material, just like in Poland. And people imposed this on themselves internally within the West. And yet, historically, these ideas have lost. These ideas have come crashing down as staple and political and architectural structures. Yet in the minds of elite Western academics, the softer, non-vanguard version of these ideas are alive and well and kicking and are in control. It's largely true that most artistic departments, used as a term for the humanities and the social sciences across the board, are in the hands of the West's most ferocious ideological opponents inside the West, mentally. Not in terms necessarily of how people live their lives and so on, but in terms of what they accept. The worst ideas in the world are some of the ideas in this room from the perspective of these sorts of people. And they know what they're against, although most of them are, in a sense, more coherently in favour of what they're for. Most left-wingers and liberals, like Tony Blair, begin with the first thing Blair ever did, was to go on an National Front march. The first moment was negative. He knew what he was against almost before he knew what he was for. But many of these people actually know what they're for as well. And what they're for is a world without any prior signification. Now, deconstruction is the idea that you have a text before you, and this text has a system of rhetoric which is related to the personality of an individual author. But the author doesn't exist, it's just a text, it's just a signification. And what you do is you split the power of the rhetoric, the oratory, the nature of the language used, the control of the phrases used, the essentialist markers that delimit the promiscuity of linguistic and moral choice, and you deconstruct that, you open up the field of signification so that language can flow freely in its joy and in its meaningless splendor. This is called jouissance, the joy of deconstructing the text so that it reveals its anti-essentialist possibilities when the crypto-fascistic moments of identity in it have been removed. And this is what they do. They will take an author like Céline, who's a French National Socialist, essentially, if words have any meaning, and they will say, this anti-Semitic statement shows the insecurity of a lower middle-class background. He obviously wet his bed, he was beaten by his father. And they will deconstruct every particular notification. And actually, they will say, actually, this is a philo-Semitic text, which loves foreigners, which loves homosexuals, and is egalitarian. The whole point of deconstruction is you reverse the meaning of the text. But these ideas have their dangers, because there are certain things that liberals believe are sacred. And there are certain things that they believe shouldn't be deconstructed and are beyond deconstruction. And one of the primary deconstructive thinkers, who wasn't necessarily elected, was a man called Paul de Man, who was head of English and philosophy, head of the Yale School of Deconstruction at this Ivy League college. Ivy League college, Yale, has a school of deconstruction. Yes, it does. Acting against the West in order to affirm the negation of its identity. This is the sort of thing it said. Now, Paul de Man was head of philosophy there, but Paul de Man had a secret past. Far worse than beating his wife or something like that. Paul de Man was a collaborator in Belgium, in occupied Belgium, and was a minor member of the Rexist movement of Leon de Grelle, and it was all very serious. And he also wrote some articles for a magazine like Scorpion, shall we say, but it was in occupied Belgium at the time, so it was a bit more serious. And when it was discovered that he had this past, the whole of the movement of deconstruction gathered at the University of Alabama in the deep south of the United States to discuss this unfortunate recrudescence of essentialism in the time of their chief American guru. Derrida came up with a remarkable wheeze. He said that because there were articles on one side of the page of these collaborationist journals that were more extreme than what de Man had written, de Man was actually protesting against the extremism of the rival and mirror-reflective text with his own understated fascism, therefore revealing that he was in internal and critical protest at the nature of this foul language, and this foul language in another way. Interestingly, deconstruction and post-structuralism have never survived this particular revelation. And it's not fallen off the cliff, but it's much less fashionable now than it was. It's also begun to be attacked by certain hard leftists who are more materialistic, more pro-science and so on, and who don't agree with this type of what they consider to be empty and rather vacuous theorising. So there's been a certain revisionism. Not all of these ideas have it their own way. There are often outriders who are dissentient. There are often critics within the system as well as without who are progressive. You can only criticise progress if you are yourself a progressive. You know, this is part of the deal. So there are progressive critiques of this sort of thing. Levi-Strauss loathed elements of modern culture, loathed modernist art, and so on. There's a degree to which certain impermissible reactions, or fleets to the essence, as it's sometimes called, are permitted by very radical theorists. There's also certain of the revisionists, like Sion, for example, who've played with post-structuralist ideas, which makes them very dangerous. As soon as I heard about post-structuralism in the 1980s, I knew that certain revisionist types would make use of some of these methodological tricks, because it's inevitable. You can apply deconstruction to deconstruction. You can get Celine's text, you can get the deconstructive answer to the text, and then you can deconstruct the deconstructive answer to the text, and you end with Celine again. So you think, what's the point of doing all that? And the point of doing all that was to question the affirmations of Western society. That's what the point of all that is. And the people who flood into the humanist disciplines, in sociology, in fine art, and elsewhere, if you say, well, you know, Caravaggio was a homosexual. People say, oh, well, you know, dangerous assumptions there, you know, a bit too essentialist. And are you reading the Arthur of the artist who was the text too much into his own work, and so on? And it creates a sort of fog of uncertainty. It creates an area of the absence of affirmation, the absence of pride, certain of the absence of the justification of hierarchy, which it's all about. Ken Livingstone's a populist, libertarian, left-wing politician. When he was asked about political correctness and banning children, black children in South London, from saying nursery rhymes like bar, bar, black sheep and so on, he said that's evening standard garbage. He said political correctness is an attempt to change people's minds and language. It is concentrated on two egalitarian premises: absolute moral equality in questions of race and gender. He's a real leftist. That's what it's really about. It's not about any of this epiphenomena. It's about making inegalitarian and elitist assumptions morally and linguistically impermissible. And if they're impermissible for a university professor, they'll be impermissible for a struggling fourth-level past degree student, and they'll be impermissible for a lower middle-class bloke who sort of half believes what's in the Daily Mail, and they will be impermissible right the way down the society, and they will, in a garbled way, come out of every news channel you can speak of. Many liberals now say, well, we're fighting for Western values in Iraq, but what are Western values? And do we have a right to fight for them? And in any case, you know, should we affirm ourselves that we're attacking their essentialism or their own? We should deconstruct at home first before we go abroad, imposing our signifiers upon these worthy foreigners, and so on. You see, it begins small, it begins with a debate about language, but it becomes much more powerful. And in the intellectual ideologies that operate outside the sciences now, these ideas are de rigueur. To be actually against them is to morally shock. Far more than, you know, transgressive postmodern art in relation to the Turner Prize and that sort of thing. Now, things like the Turner Prize did bring me to Stewart Home. Now, the Turner Prize is attacked by Home, but from the left. You can only criticise left from left. He's to the left of the Turner Prize. The sort of art that's exhibited in the Turner Prize, which is a sort of stitch up by various dealers, particularly in the 1990s in relation to a particular school or postmodern artist who came out of Goldsmiths College of Art in the late 80s, early 90s, and Hearst and Emin and Turk were the most prominent of the three. They were bigged up with a lot of big money, and people wanted to make male money as a result of it. However, it's based on an ideology called anti-objectivist art, which comes from the 1960s and was largely part of the hippie movement. John Lennon was involved extensively in anti-objectivist art. Do you remember getting into a bag for peace? This is where a naked John Lennon, covered with hair, would get into a bag, And Yoko Ono would draw, who was a member of a group called Fluxus, would draw the zip on the bag, and Lenin would stay there for a day, because the idea was that if we were all naked and in bags and covered with hair, we wouldn't fight, and there would be no more war, and there would be a realm of peace on this earth for us all to enjoy. You know, another Fluxus fad that Yoko was very keen on was the revelation of the buttocks. They would sit there naked before the NBC and CBS and ABC and the BBC and all the big channels of that era, revealing their naked buttocks, because of course you won't fight if you reveal yourself in that way. And the point was to avoid struggle by not fighting. These ideas had little currency and didn't last too long. But anti-objectivist art begins there, and somebody like Stewart Home begins his particular intellectual career at this time. Home's an anarchist, essentially, or a libertarian communist, or an anarcho-communist. His one claim to fame is writing a book. He's written many books, but his one real claim to fame is a book called The Assault on Culture. The Assault on Culture. From Lettrism to Class War, it's called. And he deals with a miscellany of extreme left avant-garde groups that come out of the major modernist tendencies as they end. Modernism is a very complicated area. It goes back to the middle of the 19th century. It's a reaction in part against photography. It's a desire to go inside the mind and fantasize. Was despised for much of the late 19th century, early part of the 20th century, then became the major aesthetic discourse of liberal humanism. There's a complication there, because both fascism and communism flirted with modernism. Most of them then turned against it, although the Portuguese, Spanish and Italian far-right regimes made use of moderate modernist tendencies. Modernism's always had a devilish side from the perspective of left humanism, because a lot of the early modernists were fascists, were anti-humanists, and were radical rightists, like Ezra Pound, like Wyndham Lewis, like Marinetti, like Gordie-Beska, like Celine, and so on, like Marinetti. That's because there was an anti-democratic element to it, because of course modernism was a bohemian attack upon the sensibility of the majority. It loathes what ordinary people think about art, so it will destroy what they want and impose what intellectuals want. And it's a sort of vanguard hostility to the boring majority, you know, bomb the suburbs. That's the sort of view of modernism. But that can tend to the right as well as the left in strange moments, because national cultures were still alive to the degree that there could be national modernisms. Expressionism was a largely Germanic form, Futurism was an Italian form, Surrealism was a French form. Surrealism was the only major modernist movement that linked formally with communism through the radical state socialist ideas of its founder, André Breton. Basically, Surrealism died with him. But as it died, all sorts of shards came out of it, one of which was called Situationism. Situationism was a minor ideological current that's achieved quite a bit of currency, particularly on the far left, because a lot of the students in 1968 mouthed situationist slogans. The media was convulsed to find that when, on the one hand, there were these hippies sort of throwing bricks at members of the CRS, a very tough central riot police in Paris and the other big cities. But they would paint these slogans on walls saying, "Seize the imagination," or "Release the factories," or "I want to play with myself," or something like that. You know, strong, powerful, philosophical stuff like this that they would spray paint on these walls. And most of these were situationist slogans taken from a book called Society of the Spectacle, written by Guy Debord in the late 1960s. Debord later committed suicide in dubious circumstances. There was another intellectual associated with this tendency called Raoul Van Ergen, who wrote the Book of Pleasures and the Revolution of Everyday Life. Now, these books had a lot of impact in revolutionary artistic scenes. It's very interesting to notice this combination of far-left art, anti-social practice, misanthropy, and extreme amounts of money, and their ability to attract each other in disassociative ways. Anti-objectivist art began as a hostility to the art market. It began by producing artworks that no one would want to buy. That was the whole point. You were rebelling against the market. They used to have marches on Sotheby's saying, "Death to Sotheby's, death to Sotheby's." Now they're all sold in Sotheby's for enormous amounts of money. The most classic example of this was an Italian conceptual artist in the 1970s called Manzoni. And Manzoni used to sell blocks of his own audio. He used to sell blocks of his own audio in gold-tinted, beautifully framed, sort of 18th century gold leaf tins. And Italian-American heiresses used to buy this for $7,000, $7,000 a tin, you know, to say at their kinky and trendy party that I bought one, you know. And that, in a sense, it was, because artists always loathe the dealers. They always loathe the middlemen. a third of whom have always been of a certain ethnicity. Always. Third of art dealers are Jews, third of art dealers are homosexuals, not always an overlapping category. And but artists loathe the middlemen, and there's a desire to revenge yourself on the middlemen by producing work that can't be sold, that's impossibilist, if you like. But the market can sell anything. You can sell debt as an asset from which you can make more money. So why not sell cars that are bolted together? There's a famous case of one artist who was neo-conceptual and was an action artist who tried to sell his dead body after he committed suicide. This was a man called Schwarzkobler, who's Austrian, and he wound himself in mummification and either did commit suicide or feigned to commit suicide. I hope not to ruin anyone's appetite by some of this, but it's all true, I assure you of this. There's several other ones who left bits of their bodies, including arms and legs, in various galleries and so on. And this was photographed in the 1970s. This was action art, wasn't it? I mean, let's face it, there's something was going on here. Holmes' book, The Assault on Culture, has Schwarzkobler's pre-corpse mummified body on its front, so you know what you're getting. Now, the movements with which Home deals are situationism, of which he's a left-wing critic. In other words, he's a critic from the left, within the left. He's a critic of, there's lecturism, which is another idea that relates to certain formalist and linguistic ideas. There's a movement for the imagist Bauhaus, which is a splinter from Breton surrealism. There are also slightly dangerous movements, because Home has an equivocal element. Not in what he wants, but in what will happen. One of the dangers about the cult of the new and the cult of the future is that there can be different futures that left-wing people don't like. And there was a movement in the 1970s called mail art. And this woman would do these traditional biographical pictures, very traditional academic art, the sort of thing Orpen would have done at the turn of the 20th century and just in and around the Great War. And she would send them to people. She would send them to the Prime Minister. She would send them to the Pope. She would send them to the Chief Rabbi. And they were all pictures of Adolf Hitler. And they opened them and were appalled at this, and it was quite a scandal. And she said, but I'm not a Nazi. She said, I'm just being transgressive. I'm doing what is non-bourgeois. Hitler may have done evil things, but I'm not evil. I'm just painting a picture. It's just representation. So you see, if you adopt the cult of the new, and Home had this idea called neoism, where he wants to create culture anew, which is largely based on Marionette's ideas that you can bomb everything and begin again because we are the masters of the ruins. It's the rhetoric of people who've never been to a real war, you see, as those who were just about to, because a lot of this stuff came out in 1912 and was just the quivering in the antennae of the Armageddon that was about to erupt. Although, to be frank, many of the Marionetteists, the futurists, actually did fight in the war because they believed in war. They glorified war. We glorify men. We glorify war. This is why they linked with Mussolini later. And or some of them did. Now, Home's work is based upon the idea that you can go beyond the left and push even that which is left-wing further left. You see, he's in this odd position because the left never thinks it's won. Even when it's triumphant, even when many dons agree with some of their assumptions, they think it's not gone far enough. The revolution's been betrayed. You need to be pushed further. More radicalism, more self-criticism, more anti-essentialism. It's not enough. Turds in a box, not enough. Deconstructing classic opera, not enough. Turandot and other operas now, even in the West End, they often have a urinal on the stage. Urinal, what's that about? That's Duchamp's idea of the ready-made, you see. This plate is art. Who are you to say it's not? I look at this work, I mediate it, I objectivise it as my view of life. The stained dregs of life in this coffee cup, life ending in doom. Didn't Beckett say they were born they were born over a grave, there's a cry, and then it's all over? You see art. So I want 2,000 for this now. Who'll give it to me? And that's how that sort of thing starts. I heard of one bloke at English National Opera, and the critic said, slightly bemused, he said, what a little toilet on the stage? And he said, well, we're acting against the piece. We put the thing on, but we try and destroy it as we put it on. It's deconstruction. And you know why these ideas have got a hold? Because they're bored. Because they're bored with Western culture. Since the Second World War, state funding of the arts has replaced bourgeois capitalist sort of money. It's replaced aristocratic patronage. And you can only do Shakespeare so many times. you know? And there's a great tiredness to these state institutions. And this tiredness often leads to sort of nihilism in a way. Why not just tear it all down? You know, this fuddy-duddy stuff that we endlessly have to replicate with the taxpayers' money, you know? And these ideas course through, even revived, and sort of classical theatre. Racing Shakespeare is the favourite one. At the beginning of the 20th century, Othello was always played by a white man blacked up. Olivier, very famously in the 50s and thereafter. Middle of the century, always played by a black actor. Because you have to foreground the nature of race and the nature of oppression and the nature of Shakespeare's unfortunate, alienating and objectifying tendencies. Oh dear. Now, usually, Othello's played by a white actor. Because not to black up is to draw attention to the hideous racism of the piece, so that guilt should be infused in the audience to the crime of Western civilization. 9 million dead. Farrakhan says in the United States, never mind the 6, what about the 9? The 9 million who died in the Atlantic slave trade. What about us? There was a famous Richard Eyre version of The Merchant of Venice in the 1990s, when the female lead apologises for the shower on stage, kneeling before the audience. Don't remember that in the text, actually. Don't remember that in the original play. And this is ironic, considering that some of these ideas have come out of this idea of extreme textual specificity. But you could always change the text when you want. It's only a text, you know, and this sort of thing. So there is a sort of comedic element to these ideas. But I assure you that if it would be very instructive for everyone here to go to the Institute of Contemporary Arts. The ICA is in Pall Mall. It's near the Queen, you know, it's right in the centre of all of the establishment buildings. And it's all very nice in there, you know, all very nice, mellow lighting and all this. And you go in, there's a bookshop in there. And that is very interesting, because that bookshop's like a cathedral bookshop to this type of culture. Virtually every idea, I mean, Holmes' books are all prominently displayed in that particular bookshop. All of these deconstructed, anti-identity, post-racial, non-class, non-gender specific, gender-neutral language sort of particularisms are all there, volume after volume after volume. Actually, Home did a book once that had sandpaper on the cover. So it would cut up all the books next to it, you see. Revenge on the book. And he'd also damage yourself when you touched it, you see. So he's attacking the reader. William S. Burroughs was once asked, what do you want to do with the reader? And he said, kill him. I want somebody to open the page and be so appalled that they virtually drop into it, you know? There was a famous moment with the 1984. Remember that? The BBC one, the one with Peter Cushing in the 1950s. There was a Mrs. Trellis of North Wales who allegedly did drop dead during the rat scene. Room 101. She was watching this on a state-subsidised channel on the BBC, art programmes on the BBC, and when O'Brien gets the rats out, you know, in the Chinese torture scene, you know, do it to Julia, you know, and that sort of thing, she just caved over, poor old Mrs. Trellis, and went straight over, and the MP was straight on the thing, he was in the Commons, saying it's disgraceful that the state broadcaster is killing its own constituents with art, you know. You couldn't make it up, could you really? But there is a degree to which the desire to attack the audience is very much part of this art. There's actually a form of art called auto-destructive art by Metzger, where the art actually blows up, or a tip of acid, a cube of acid would turn over on one of those sort of Meccano wheels, you know, one of those sort of armature things, and the tin tips up and pours acid down the front, and that sort of thing. So the art attacks you, you attack the art attacks itself. And then you buy what's left, even though what's left has been completely destroyed. These ideas actually entered into popular culture because a lot of rock bands and so on, they're made up of students who go to art colleges. And the Who used to destroy their instruments on stage. Pete Townsend, when he wasn't looking at dubious sites on the internet, was wrecking his guitar. And these guitars are expensive things, you know, and keep it plugged in. And he'd smash it on the ground and sparks would be going off. I think it's totally contrary to health and safety, personally, you know. But he'd smash the thing and it would blow up and blow across the thing, you know, and that sort of thing. And all the crowd would be chanting and this sort of thing. And this was based on the notion of auto-destructive art. But of course they were working class lads and there were dangerous moments of essentialism in the Who because they always had the Union flag behind them when they performed. Oh, the danger of those estates, you know, more deconstruction, that's what's required. Now, Home criticised the situations because they were laws of Hegelian theory and therefore allowed certain religious notions in from the outside. There was a communist called Jean Barrot who wrote a critique of situationism. He was a later supporter of Pol Pot, but he's not heard of too much these days. Certainly wasn't being heard of actually had been Cambodian, you know. Now, Home got into trouble a couple of years ago, and Larry O'Hara, who's a sort of libertarian, anti-right-wing critic, who's prepared to be at least reasonably factual up to a point, Larry O'Hara wrote an article called Stewart Home's Fascist Friends. Because if you advocate new areas of culture, total newness, you will attract in people who don't necessarily believe in equitable variables. And he attracted certain people, certainly Richard Lawson, who's well known for the National Party and Scorpion and Perspectives, and had a website called Flux Europa, and was a left European nationalist, I think it's fair to say. He also struck up a bit of a relationship with Bill Hopkins, an old friend of mine. And there's a film, 6 minutes of Stewart Home interviewing Bill Hopkins. It's on YouTube. Now, he's been heavily vilified for this because of an ideological detour into the concept of the new, he forgot progressive verities. And he's recovered, but you know, it's bad news to reach out to radicals before you know who they are. You can get into deep trouble doing that. And he has. Because people say, didn't he have some friends who were, that's what's remembered in this tagging era and Google your name sort of an age. Now, Home believes that everyone can create culture. Just as there are certain classical music concerts in the 1970s where the orchestra would make it up as they went along. Xenakis was another one. You would turn up and you wouldn't have a piece, you would deconstruct the music. Indeed, they would tear the music up before the performance and stamp on it in a rage at the bourgeois class and that sort of thing, and then they would sort of make some music. Now, Home believes that everybody can do that. He calls it the universal proletarianization of culture. The universal proletarianization of culture. And he idolizes these slightly rightist elements. He idolizes these skinhead novels in the 1970s. Does anyone remember these novels by Richard Allen called Skinhead and Swayhead and She's My Bitch and all these sorts of novels that used to be read under the table in schools, you know, and were read in reformatory schools, teased in reformatory schools, you know, no reading in this borstal, you know, this sort of, and they were written by this old drunk on the South Coast called Richard Allen. And Home loves all this. And he's written several books called Red London's and the one. He's also written books that are just swear words. The C word is the title, oh yes, and the S word and the F word. These are all in Smiths. They're all in Waterstones. And he's done it because he thinks, why not? And also, I'll push distribution to such a degree that are they going to go on Radio 4 and say, well, we have books with all sorts of swear words in them, but we won't allow them on the cover. You know, no, the Royal Chamberlain lives in memory. We will not allow it on the cover. And Holmes saying, why not? Why not? Are you some bourgeois snob, mate? You know, I'm pushing this in front of you. He's also a very extreme homosexual. You would have to have this. So his works are this sort of cartographic fantasy of proletarianised homosexual blokes rampaging around London. This is on sale in any Waterstones. Books called C and S and F and read. No, I've looked at the covers and I've read the theory, did we? But the theory is important in a way because at the end of the assault on culture, he endorses class war. Now, class war is a group that emerged in the early 1980s and it's led by an anarchist called Ian Bowden. And they do believe in Bakunin's ideas, total war upon the state. When Bakunin was asked, what is anarchy? He said, total revolution against God. And that is what anarchism believes, a total revolt against all ideas of transcendence. Total idea of revolt against all ideas of hierarchy. Pull it down, destroy it. There's a famous story about Bakunin in E.H. Carr's, a Soviet-Philic writer, biography. Bakunin's riding along, because he was an aristocrat, of course. If you want to destroy everything, you're an aristocrat first, you know? And he's riding along, and so he sees some brigands robbing a house. And they're smashing it to pieces with axes and so on. And he says, stop, in Russian, you know, and gets out and joins the brigands. And starts destroying and running out of the paintings and butting them and leaping up and down on them and hurling bricks through the windows and all this. I don't know, you know. Somebody who owed him money, a rival surf owner, you know. And when somebody said, why are you doing, Mikhailovich, why are you doing this? He said, because it's there. because it's there. And Home's view is that destruction is a creative passion. First you destroy, then you create on the destruction. Even as you create, you destroy because you level the field for new forms. Neoism, the cartography of inversion. And if you don't like it, you'll get a bit of this. You know, it's this, it's this sort of stuff. And the interesting thing is that these ideas are not revered. They're eccentric ideas, even within the milieu of the cultural left, but they're there. Scorpion's not sold in the ICA bookshop. Alain de Benoit's not sold in the ICA bookshop. Books about Heidegger are sold in the ICA bookshop. Heidegger, monster of Nazism, a philosophy of inhumanity exposed. Heidegger and the Jewish question. Unanswered questions. Who was his mistress? We demand the facts. Heidegger, 400 pages of his party membership between 1933 and 1934. Husserl, did he ban him from the library? The truth. Heidegger, deconstructed, Pluto Press, in 3 editions. You know, that's in the ICA library. But the authors of that which constitutes European identity are, for the most part, conspicuously absent from the ICA library. Class war, of course, has died many years ago, and Bowden's largely retired from active politics. He appeared on Jonathan Ross once, who I call Jonathan Dross. Jonathan Dross. And he appeared wearing a wig, screaming and ranting. But it was just treated as a freak show, you know, just something to laugh at, really. However, for our point of view, not altogether laughable, because a group called Antifa emerged from class war. Antifa would very much like to beat us all to death. I mean, they really would. And but they're very small and, you know, of little significance. The interesting thing is he was drawn to class war because they're situational. Because it's not going to succeed, is it? But you create a happening space. You create action art in society. You do. Remember the March on the Rich? Bash the rich. Remember the marches in Henry? Bash the rich, bash the rich. You know, and this sort of thing. Bored policemen, drongos and hippies and white Rastafarians, people with sort of purple Mohicans and this sort of thing, walking along, surrounded by the special patrol group, screaming execration at the bourgeois class and that sort of thing. It's all good fun, you know, and then they go back on the train up to Twyford or wherever it was, you know. And Bowden was there, you know, the hard men were there. There's a famous moment of anarchism in Chicago where all these very bourgeois people are eating in an extremely rich restaurant, and the anarchists unfurl a banner in front of them saying, "Behold, your future executioners." And all this, and they love this sort of sport as play, as action, as theory. Anarchism, unlike communism, has a theory, because of course anarchism's to the left of communism. Anarchism has a theory called direct action on the anger of the class. Which of course is terrorism, really. I mean, they don't call it that, but that's essentially what it is. And these sort of stunts, even that class war stunt, make the middle class afraid, you know. Tossing and turning in their beds in Henley, wondering if those Mohican yobs are coming for them. And those demos are very interesting. I once went on one of those demos and watched. And the hardcore anarchs, the hardcore activists stand at the back. And they throw forward the hippies and the drongos and the others. And they're the ones who are beaten by the special patrol group or whatever the riot squad's called now. And they're on the ground and they're covered in blood. And the policemen step on them and kick them. This was the 80s. I mean, I saw it with my own eyes. You know, it's not travesty of British behaviour. I saw it, you know. But the hardcore activists in leather jackets are at the back. And when one goes down, there's another there, you know. Because the masses are just fuel for anarchy. The point of these doctrines is that you open a space in the society where you can create new forms. Because when you open a space, anything can happen. You know? If you assassinate a politician, anything can happen. That's why they used to assassinate them all the time in the 19th century. So these sorts of ideas of rage and deconstruction and alienation, particularly impinging on all forms of identity, I've probably reached their high water mark, but the very fact that they can be canvassed, the very fact that they're in the ICA, they're in the ENO, they're in the theoretical book branch of the National Theatre, all state subsidised, there's tens and tens of millions of pounds are spent on these institutions every year through the art boards and so on. The fact that these ideas are in the Western Academy is a testament to the fact that communistic doctrines of radical destruction and deconstruction have taken over the mindset in the society. People who speak against them are Well, they're nowhere to be seen, basically, because they're sort of terrified. They're partly waiting for the next fad, really, in the hope that some of this stuff will wash away. But the interesting thing is that they always know what they're against. His Home's certainly aware of the new right. He used to edit a magazine called Smile, which was a nihilist communist magazine. That's what it said on the front. It's like, you go to Smith's, would you like to buy a nihilist communist magazine? Smile. And it would have, I don't know, it would have a picture about Lenin, it would have an article about Lenin, it would have an article about the Bono gang, then it would have a diseased genitals. Because it's to shock the bourgeois audience, so to express the hatred of the masses, and in that transgression you open up a moral space for more radicalism of the mind and of the spirit. It is psychologically subversive, and they know what they're doing. The shocked person says, oh, disgusting trash, and throws it away. They've actually had an effect on the effect of rejection before the next strike. There's a degree to which that sort of militancy, my view has always been that sort of militancy has to be stood up to. And you have to fight back. And you have to fight back as hard and as ruthlessly as they do. That's why they sort of are aware of us and fear us. And Stewart Home also has an interesting view of race, which is an original formulation. I've never heard it, even from a Trotskyist, and he's not a Trotskyist. He believes that race doesn't exist, but the masses believe it does. Now that's an interesting formulation, because if you think about it, you either have it as a foregrounded form of iterization. It's being, Dasein, being in being, as Heidegger would call it. It's that which is there. It's biological. It's there. It's foundational. It's prior. It's elemental. It's essential. Or you don't believe that. Maoists and extreme communists believe that all humans are a white sheet of paper. Any sexuality, any ethnic specification, any culturalization, any level of intellect can be pre-programmed into you. As Maoist people would say, you can torture a man into progressive ideas to the degree that they're coming out of his ears. Do you remember what O'Brien says to Winston Smith in 1984? First we make you love Big Brother, then we kill you. Don't you remember, Winston, he says, you're just a cell in the body of the party. Do you die if you cut your fingernails? Do you remember that? And the great actors like Sir Richard Burton and so on played that part. Now, Home's idea is interesting in a way because they believe in false consciousness, don't they? He's basically saying race is the false consciousness of the masses, but if nothing is prior, then reality is in the consciousness of the masses. Therefore, if the masses think that race exists, it does exist, even in far left terms, because only that which is thought moment by moment in the struggle exists. So in a strange sort of way, he's ended up with a right-wing deviation within Marxist cultural logic. He's actually got back to a position he says he refutes, but it's an interesting one. Because if you notice, the dip in biological thinking in the middle of the 20th century, as a reaction to the Second World War, is the high point for these type of new left ideas. Now that biology is re-emerging in the last 30 years. And it's very interesting, for example, that the Anti-Defamation League in the United States opposed the creation of the Human Genome Project. And many gay libertarian groups opposed the Human Genome Project. They're radically opposed to the idea of the biological investigation of the building blocks of life because it will lead to the possibility of acceptance by the masses of a prior essentialism. There was an interesting incident last year when the Genome Project Scientific Review Board wrote to the German Academy of Sciences and said that in our opinion, life is 80% natural law and prior biological purpose. Not 60%, not 70%, but 80%. Man is socialized by 20%. And I view the socialization as environment. And environment is ecology, and ecology is a species of biology. So in a way, it's all biological. And the German Academy wrote back, we cannot accept this thinking. We cannot accept this thinking because we understand that your postulate is from good intentions, but it draws us perilously close to rejecting the methodology of the basic law upon which contemporary German governance, state, society, and academic learning is based. So the German government says that a particular scientific outcome is wrong, and as a citizen of the contemporary United German Republic, founded under occupation by Adenauer in 1948, you have to repudiate it. It doesn't care what science says. We repudiate science. This is a revolutionary development, really, whereby the left, the organ of progress, is rejecting science. There's a concept on the new left of scientism. Scientism. Science is ugly, male, reactionary, authoritarian, phallocratic, all this sort of stuff. Strong streak of feminism in all of these discourses. The left has sort of given up on that. Many leftists are now debating about how they deal with biology. Peter Singer is head who wrote the book Animal Liberation, which founded that whole movement. Liberate the animals, you filthy speciesists, put down that ham sandwich, that sort of thing. And Singer, of course, of a certain ethnicity, from Australia, where he was in the Australian Senate as a civil libertarian and green, radical green. He's a utilitarian. He's a very interesting thinker, because he's introducing a new hard liberalism. Singer says maybe biological ordinance is true. Maybe disability is inherited. Maybe gender is inherited. Maybe sexuality is due to brain function. Maybe the right is correct. But what you must do is you must pass every law and every methodology that lies behind the law, jurisprudence, to make sure that there is either equality of opportunity or equality of outcome, or those who proselytize for inequality of outcome are not allowed to affect it by the nature of their discourse. So what he's saying is that even if biology is unequal, you make the society so impervious to that logic, even though you've got a hierarchy, that it's not aware of that. That's the most important and intelligent form of far leftism. They can only sustain anti-science. They built their entire credo on science. They can't repudiate it. That's just a stunt for a couple of decades. They're going to have to accept the Human Genome Project. They're going to have to accept the biological and prior ordination of man. Every time I go into an NHS clinic, there's a leaflet for transplants. And in the middle of that leaflet, you're asked about your race. It says, are you white Caucasian? Are you Asian? Are you Negroid or African? Diaspora African, all these little boxes. And that's because human internal tissues will not transplant or graft as well in relation to one race as another. Prior racial difference within the taxonomy of the human, even at a physical level. If a scientist at Oxford or Cambridge or the London School of Economics had said that in the 1960s or 1970s openly, they'd have been rioting. They'd been rioting in the canteen, they'd been rioting in the lecture hall. The Special Patrol Group would have been on the canvas. He would have been hounded out of that place of learning. It's now in an NHS leaflet. Quietly, no fuss. It's just intruded there as a fact. Who can object to it? We're helping people. We're helping people. Now, talking about helping people, there are ultra-left groups, ultra-liberal groups in the United States who are campaigning against certain forms of medicine that affect individual ethnicities. There are certain diseases that blacks and Africans suffer from, particularly sickle cell anemia, which is almost congruent to them. And certain drugs which have genetic potential and originate from some of the theory and experimentation of the Human Genome Project react primarily on their group. And there are ultra-liberal groups who are campaigning to not allow the Food and Drug Agency to license these. Why? Why? Because it undermines the idea that man is a white sheet of paper, that you can do what you want, that there is no prior identity. They would rather blacks suffer than that these drugs were produced, because they admit the prior biological differentiation of the human. And when you begin there, when you begin with such a monstrous prior essentialism, the doors to you-know-what are swinging open, you see. So you must close down the thing before you even begin to agree with what you disagree with. Thank you very much.